Now joined by Patrick Maguire, because it's time for this.
PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio, unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley.
And Patrick Maguire. So
you must get Lindsay Hall to sort that out.
Yes,
soon.
we do need to get a whole load of those so that we've got all bases covered. So Tim Shipman's away this week. I assume that wherever he is on his holidays, he's got a big bucket of popcorn in front of him, and while he's been watching Dominic Cummings. So we are now 2.5 hours in. Patrick, what's your main takeaway from it?
I think Matt Hancock is going to spend this afternoon drafting a lengthy statement or op-ed that may appear in a newspaper tomorrow, defending himself against those allegations. Is my main takeaway.
That's interesting. You think that's the? I mean, I suppose in terms of a lot of this is, there's lots of dates and timings and reproduction values and all of that, but the raw politics of the Prime Minister's most senior, only 6 months ago, Prime Minister's most senior aide appearing in public to give the current sitting Prime Minister, it's fair to say, quite a kicking, revealing that he at one point wanted to be injected on television with coronavirus. That's quite a thing.
Well, and also putting him on a par with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
With whom Dom Cummings worked to keep out of power with Boris Johnson. And
that's the interesting thing. Why, if you thought he was so awful, why did you campaign for him to remain as Prime Minister? That's one interesting question. But there's a lot of politics. He said that Matt Hancock should be fired. Some of the others, Rishi Sunak seems to have come of it quite well. Actually, Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance seem to come out of it all right so far. We'll have to wait and see what happens when we get onto the second lockdown. But we know that Keir Starmer has been watching all morning. This is a big test for him as leader of the opposition. How hard do you think he's going to go on it all?
Well, there's a wealth of material there. And we know Keir Starmer is often uncomfortable or disinclined to go to the jugular himself, in his own words. But now he can quote WhatsApp tweets in abundance.
And let's find out how much of the last 2.5 hours he's just going to read out. Let's go live to the House of Commons. This is Keir Starmer.
The leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about Hillsborough and Mike Weatherby? Mr. Speaker, this morning the Prime Minister's former closest adviser said, when the public needed us most, the government failed. Does the Prime Minister agree with that?
Mr. Speaker, the handling of this pandemic has been one of the most difficult things this country has had to do for a very long time. And none of the decisions have been easy. To go into a lockdown is a traumatic thing for a country. To deal with a pandemic on this scale has been appallingly difficult, and we've at every stage tried to minimise loss of life, to save lives, to protect the NHS, and we have followed the best scientific advice that we can, Mr. Speaker.
And there, in a nutshell, is politics. The criticism that you failed, you let the country down, and Boris Johnson's response is, this is an incredibly difficult thing. We did our best. It's very difficult. We try to minimise loss of life. The implication being it didn't always go perfectly well.
Yes, there are two things. One, there's the old line about, I may have even listened to it on Times Radio earlier, about voters not caring about how crises begin, but how they end. Government's passing on that metric. But the second thing, saying it's not easy, I'd say there's one flaw with Dominic Cummings' testimony, his argument, is that so much of it relies on a sort of deus ex machina argument where he says, if only you'd read this book on super forecasting, or if only you'd put this data scientist friend of mine in charge that nobody's ever heard of. It's all sort of, if only Superman was in charge of the pandemic response, things would have been fine. And whereas the government, quite rightly, or perceptively, is betting on the public having sympathy for the fallibility of humans facing a totally unprecedented policy question.
There is also, it's a sort of side point this, but there's also something ironic about Keir Starmer now, aligning himself with Dominic Cummings when the Labour Party had done so much to discredit him and criticise him following the trip to Barnard Castle. And even at one point during the local election campaign this year, their messaging for a couple of days was that Dominic Cummings had a pay rise and nurses hadn't had a pay, and yet now he's a great ally. Well, anyway, let's go back. Question 2 from Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, can I remind the Prime Minister that 1 year ago, almost to the day, he described his former adviser as in his words, in every respect, acting responsibly, legally and with integrity. This morning, that same adviser has said that senior ministers fell, his words, disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect of its government, and that lives were lost as a result. Does the Prime Minister accept that central allegation and that his inaction led to needless deaths?
No, Mr. Speaker, and of course all those matters will be reviewed in the course of the public inquiry that I have announced. I notice that he is fixated as ever on the rear-view mirror, Mr. Speaker, whilst we on this side of the House are getting on with our job of rolling out the vaccines, making sure that we protect the people of this country. And that, I think, has been the decisive development on which I think people are rightly focusing. And I can tell the House that in spite of the continuing concern that we have about the Indian variant, we are increasing our vaccination programme at such a rate that we can now ask everybody over 30 to come forward, Mr. Speaker, and get vaccinated.
Keir Starmer.
Oh, and there we are again. I mean, actually, Boris Johnson's immediate answer is most interesting. Keir Starmer saying, do you accept that your actions led to needless deaths? And he replies, no, Mr. Speaker.
Well, that is a direct rebuke to almost everything Dominic Cummings has said this morning. And it's interesting that he immediately followed that with the segue into, but nobody wants to talk about that anyway.
Yeah,
which
you're fixated on the rear view mirror.
Which, interestingly, is what Grant Shapps on the broadcast round this morning said about Dominic Cummings himself. Clearly, the government believes that Keir Starmer and Dominic Cummings, who have now both been branded Captain Hindsight, I don't know what happens in the hindsight army when you've got two non-commissioned officers of the same rank.
Somebody texted in earlier saying he's Field Marshal Hindsight, Dominic Cummings, because he was obviously a bit more senior. But yeah, I suppose that's the ultimately politically to get through this. Boris Johnson can just do what he's done, and why he did so well in the local elections and everything else. Focus on, the vaccine, and rightly or wrongly, and people who really dislike Boris Johnson really hate this, but bit of recency bias, the fact that people think the vaccine programme's going well, the fact that people are quite forgiving about an unprecedented thing hit, and we didn't have a precedent to base our reaction to, but certainly back in March anyway.
But interestingly, Boris Johnson saying, no, he's not responsible, begs the question, well, when he comes to give his testimony, who is he going to blame? And, an intriguing passage in Dominic Cummings' line was Mark Sedwill, the Cabinet Secretary, and the Prime Minister both agreeing that Matt Hancock was a bit rubbish. So when the time comes, will he throw Matt Hancock under the bus as well?
Do let us know what you think about this. You can text us 87222, start your message with the word Times. What do you think about the exchanges at PMQs? Unpacked. Let's go back to the House of Commons. Question 3.
Mr. Speaker, it's no good the Prime Minister attacking me. It's his former chief advisor who's looking back and telling the world how useless the Prime Minister was in taking key decisions. His former advisor. One of the most serious points made this morning is that the Prime Minister failed to recognise the severity of this virus until it was too late, dismissing it as, quote from this morning, another scare story, like the swine flu. Does the Prime Minister recognise that account of his own behaviour? And if so, will he apologise for being so complacent about the threat that this virus posed?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think anybody could credibly accuse this government of being complacent about the threat that this virus posed at any point. We have worked flat out, Mr. Speaker, to minimise loss of life, to protect the NHS, while they have flip-flopped, Mr. Speaker, from one position to another, backing curfew one day, opposing it the next, backing lockdowns one day, opposing it the next, calling for tougher border controls one day, then saying that quarantine is a blunt instrument the next. Mr. Speaker, we have got on with the job of protecting the people of this country from one of the worst pandemics in living memory, if not the worst in living memory. We have turned the corner, and it is no thanks, Mr. Speaker, to the loyal opposition opposite.
Not so loyal opposition, possibly. I feel like we've been here before. I'm not sure that when Keir Starmer talks about, now trying to quote Dominic Cummings, it necessarily worked. The thing that, have you read Danny Finkelstein's column in the Times today?
I always read Danny Finkelstein's column.
Because he's there talking about, he was your former advisor. He's your former advisor now says that you've made a mess of it. And Danny's column is really interesting on this. Is that basically, what did Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings think was going to happen when they shackled themselves to each other? How on earth could Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have thought that their story was going to end in any other way to us basically ending up in this situation? You know, Boris Johnson obviously thought that he could change Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings thought he could change Boris Johnson. And we are where we are.
But also, as you say, we've been here before in that, crucially, Labour's critique, i.e. that the government was too slow to do X, Y, Z, it was slow on locking down, it was slow on PPE, it was slow on a second lockdown and a circuit breaker. These are all questions Keir Starmer has asked of the government before. And the fact that they're now accompanied by damning testimony from Dominic Cummings doesn't change the substance of the arguments being advanced on both sides. So the reason why it doesn't feel like Keir Starmer, despite the absolutely explosive, seismic, sensational morning we've had in the committee room, delete as applicable, it doesn't feel like he's knocking out of the park, because this is a fairly run-of-the-mill session of PMQs with new topical hooks for familiar questions that the Prime Minister has answered before and given, by now, very well-worn arguments for his defence.
I think that's probably the sense. That so far, at least, Keir Starmer's questions have been quite broad and not on some of the very clear specifics. For instance, did you ask Chris Whitty to inject you with coronavirus on TV? Would be not a bad question to ask. But anyway, let's go back to the House of Commons and see if Keir Starmer thinks to ask it.
Mr. Speaker, I can see that the evidence of his former adviser is really getting to the Prime Minister this morning in that response. Another incredibly serious statement from the Prime Minister's former adviser this morning concerns the conduct of the Health Secretary, including an allegation that the Health Secretary misled other ministers and officials on a number of occasions. Now, I don't expect the Prime Minister to respond to that, but can he confirm from this morning's evidence, can the Prime Minister, can he confirm, did the Cabinet Secretary advise him, the Prime Minister, that he, the Cabinet Secretary, had, quote, lost faith in the Health Secretary's honesty?
The answer to that is no, Mr. Speaker, and I'm afraid I haven't had the benefit of seeing the evidence that he's bringing to the House. But I must say that I think what the people of this country want us all to do is to get on with the delicate business now of trying to reopen our economy and restore people's freedoms, get back to our way of life by rolling out the vaccine. I would have thought that that was a much more profitable line of inquiry for the right honourable gentleman today, and that's why I think the people of this country want us to focus on.
Well, I'm afraid I haven't had the benefit of seeing the evidence he's bringing to the House today. So Boris Johnson obviously taken the decision not to watch, so therefore he can't respond to any of the claims.
Probably wise.
As a tactic, although he did then reject the suggestion that Mark Sedwill, the then Cabinet Secretary, had suggested sacking Matt Hancock back in March of last year.
Yes, exactly, and herein lies the problem for Keir Starmer trying to brandish Dominic Cummings's oral testimony, as it were, as a trump card, because it is fundamentally a case of he said, and without note, by the way, that Dominic Cummings has not been playing the much vaunted audio recordings of everything the Prime Minister ever said privately to the Select Committee. In the absence of documentary evidence, and for the most explosive claims, there is still very little. Keir Starmer is leaving himself vulnerable to being swatted away quite.
Yeah, he's asking quite broad questions and he's getting quite broad answers, and we're not probably not getting very far on that. But I mean, a bit of support from Matt Hancock, but not masses from Boris Johnson, has to be said. Anyway, let's go backwards. This is now question number 5 from Keir Starmer.
Speaker, the Prime Minister can't have it both ways. Either his former adviser is telling the truth, in which case the Prime Minister should answer the allegations, or the Prime Minister has to suggest that his former adviser is not telling the truth, which raises serious questions about the Prime Minister's judgment in appointing him in the first place. There's a pattern of behaviour here. There was clearly a lack of planning, poor decision-making and a lack of transparency, and a Prime Minister who was absent from the key decisions, including 5 early Cobra meetings, and who was, to quote his former adviser, 1,000% too obsessed with the media. But another central allegation briefed overnight is that the Prime Minister delayed the circuit break over the autumn half-term because, quote, COVID was only killing 80-year-olds. Can I remind the Prime Minister that over 83,000 people over 80 lost their lives to this virus, and that his decision to delay for 40 days from the sage guidance on the 21st of September until the 31st of October will be seen as one of the single biggest failings of the last year. Now having been told of the evidence, does the Prime Minister accept that he used the words "COVID was only killing 80-year-olds" or words to those effect?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we saw what happened during the pandemic, and particularly he talks about the September lockdown and my approach to it, and the very, very difficult decision that the country faced. And of course, this will be a matter for the inquiry to go into. But we have an objective test, Mr. Speaker, in the sense that there was a circuit breaker of the kind he describes in Wales. It did not work, and I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely confident that we took the decisions in the best interests of the British people. When it comes to hindsight, Mr. Speaker, I could just remind the right honourable gentleman that he actually, he denied this at the time, and then had to correct it, but he voted to stay in the European Medicines Agency, Mr. Speaker, which would have made it impossible.
This really is a greatest hits edition of
for us to do
PMQs.
the vaccine rollout at the pace that we have.
There we are, Patrick Maguire.
Interestingly, not a denial on the substance of the allegation. Just as, if you recall that heady Sunday night when the Daily Mail front page talking about letting the bodies pile high first broke, Downing Street were unequivocal and said this did not happen. But every time you get a minister at the dispatch box fielding a similar allegation, Michael Gove didn't categorically deny that. That definitely wasn't a categorical denial. They choose not to be so unambiguous. So that's mildly interesting. If the rest of the answer was very much not
Drifted off into the European Medicines Agency and all of that. In terms of the art of PMQs and exploiting this crisis for political advantage, so far do you think Keir Starmer's doing enough to insert himself into this? Essentially, the star of the show today is Dominic Cummings. But, a real political skill is to insert yourself into the story of the day.
I would say Keir Starmer is encountering the problem he always faces, in that he isn't indeed inserting himself into the narrative, but he's leaving himself vulnerable, as any opposition leader would in a pandemic, of to use an Irish phrase, hurling from the ditch, or backseat driving. To say after you've missed the junction, oh, you really ought to have left the motorway there. It's a position that garners very little public sympathy or political capital for obvious reasons. And
clearly lots of you have texted in basically saying that this is, if you're a political nerd, this is absolute, this is crack in terms of your obsessions. But, we shouldn't forget in that YouGov poll you had in Red Box this week, 14% of people say they trust Dominic Cummings to tell the truth on coronavirus. So he's not necessarily although he's fascinating to listen to, he's not necessarily a trusted witness for the country.
No, and ultimately, who in their right mind is paying close attention, like you and I are, to a joint sitting of the Health and Science Select Committees?
Well, valued Times Radio listeners, but yes, I accept that they are.
Yes,
they're a class above all the rest of the country. Okay, let's go back. Let's see if Keir Starmer can pull it all together and land a punch with his final question at PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, it's not me giving evidence this morning, it's his former adviser. And I note the Prime Minister is careful not to refute these allegations. Mr. Speaker, what we're seeing today is the latest chapter of a story of confusion, chaos and deadly misjudgments from this government. From a Prime Minister governing by press release, not a plan. In the last 24 hours, we've seen the same mistakes made again, with the ridiculous way 1.7 million people in Bolton, Burnley, Bedford, Blackburn, Kirklees, Hounslow, Leicester and North Tyneside have been treated. In the light of the drip of these very serious allegations and the failure of the Prime Minister to provide even basic answers and continuing mistakes affecting millions of people, Does the Prime Minister now recognise he must bring forward the timing of the public inquiry into COVID and that it should start this summer and as soon as possible?
No, Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, I'm not going to concentrate valuable official time on that now, whilst we're still battling a pandemic. And I thought, actually, that was what the House had agreed on. And, Mr. Speaker, he continues to play these pointless political games whilst we get on with delivering on the people's priorities. 14 new hospitals, 8,771 more police on our streets. Now we're getting on with sorting out the railways, Mr. Speaker. We're giving the young people the opportunity of home ownership in a way they've never had before, with 95% more mortgages. And we've vaccinated, we've delivered 60 million vaccinations across this country. More, and he loves these European comparisons, Mr. Speaker, more than any other European country, including 22 million second doses. And that, with great respect to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I believe that is the priority of the British people. That's really what they're focused on, whilst he voted to stay in the European Medicines Agency. They vacillate, Mr. Speaker. We vaccinate. They deliberate. We deliver.
You might have noticed there's a bit more noise in the background there. There are actually a few more MPs in the House of Commons than there have been for some time. There's a slight relaxation of the rules. Although not huge cheers from either side, really, there. In the light of the drip, is probably one of my favourite visual metaphors from Keir Starmer there. He suggested the public inquiry should be brought forward to the summer and got a straightforward no.
Yes, again, an answer the Prime Minister has given before. And look, ultimately, a lot of politics, a lot of political messaging is asking the same question or making the same point again and again and again and again. Until such time as the public notice and agree with you, or until such time as you can elicit a change in direction from your opponents. Unfortunately for Keir Starmer, at the moment he's getting neither, and he's not going to get either for the foreseeable future. I mean, watching that exchange, and indeed watching the entire exchange between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, you just think, who would be leader of the opposition? One, who would be leader of the opposition during a pandemic? And three, who would be leader of the Labour Party?
I actually wonder, and he sort of touched on it in the sixth question, might he have been better focusing on handling of the pandemic now, the confusion? You listed all those countries, all those towns and cities where they'd suddenly had these rules changed. Confusion right now, and maybe referring it back to Dominic Cummings.
Yes, because Labour still have this. They're much more willing to criticise the government than they were in the early days of the pandemic for obvious reasons. But they still have this sort of vestigial desire to be constructive, be perceived as constructive. But the risk, if you focus all your criticism on a bit of the pandemic that most of the public are inclined to now forget or give the government the benefit of the doubt, and you implicitly accept the government's argument, well, it's hard not to, that the vaccine rollout is going brilliantly. And that your focus is on the first half of the pandemic, as you say, you're neglecting areas where it's still possible to make hay, to draw a line of continuity between the start of the chaos and confusion at the start of the pandemic and now, rather than implicitly accepting the government's argument that it was rubbish then, but we've really got a grip on it now.
Yeah, that would be a sort of slightly different way to sort of tie it all together. Well, that was Keir Starmer's attempt at taking on Boris Johnson. Let's hear now from Ian Blackford, the SNP leader in Westminster. This is what he had to say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of Prime Minister for those seeking justice for Hillsborough? To quote the song, "You'll never walk alone." Mr. Speaker, 128,000 people have died of coronavirus in the United Kingdom. This morning, the Prime Minister's most senior former adviser, Dominic Cummings, apologised on behalf of the UK government. He said, "When the public needed us most, we failed. We know that the Prime Minister made a series of catastrophic errors throughout the crisis. He went on holiday when he should have been leading efforts to tackle the pandemic. He was too slow to go into lockdown. He failed to secure our borders. He sent millions of people back to their offices prematurely. There is no doubt that these mistakes cost many thousands of lives. When even a disgraced figure like Dominic Cummings is willing to own up and apologise, isn't it time that the Prime Minister does the same?
Mr. Speaker, I take full responsibility for everything that has happened, and I've said before, and he will recall, both in this House and elsewhere. I am truly sorry for the suffering that the people of this country have experienced. But I maintain my point that the government acted throughout with the intention to save life and protect the NHS, and in accordance with the best scientific advice. That's exactly what we did.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The evidence we've heard this morning is extraordinary, but sadly not surprising. It paints a familiar pattern of behaviour. A negligent Prime Minister, more concerned with his own self-interest than the interests of the United Kingdom. When people were dying, the United Kingdom government was considering chickenpox parties and joking about injecting the Prime Minister with COVID live on TV. We had a circus act when we needed serious government. Isn't it the case that what the country needed leadership most, the Prime Minister was missing in action? Thousands have paid the ultimate price for his failure. When will the Prime Minister finally accept responsibility for the failures of his government?
I see what Boris Johnson has
Mr.
to say.
Speaker, as I've said repeatedly in this House, I take full responsibility for everything that the government did and will continue to do so. And one of the reasons we've set up an independent public inquiry is I believe the people of this country do deserve to have daylight shone on all the issues he raised. I must say I don't recognise the events that he describes, but I do think that we acted throughout with the intention of saving life, of protecting the NHS, and of taking the country through the worst pandemic for 100 years. And I think I think it's also true that we're in a much more fortunate position now, thanks to the efforts of the British people and the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and I'm grateful for that as well.
Well, there we are. For the first time, this idea of chickenpox parties and injecting himself with coronavirus on TV were raised but unfortunately, as is Ian Blackford's style occasionally, in a broader series of questions and thoughts and points. Although Boris Johnson did say, I don't recognise the events as he describes them.
By which he presumably means the chickenpox party never went ahead.
So. Yes, exactly.
Much to Mark Sedwill's disappointment, if you believe Dominic Cummings. Really interesting to hear Ian Blackford, of all people, cite Dominic Cummings as, and indeed Keir Starmer. One of the weird quirks of this Select Committee testimony is that you're having people who, as you said earlier, have expended so much time and energy trying to dismiss Dominic Cummings as beyond the pale, as now a paragon of every possible virtue and honesty. But yes, I think probably the most significant bit of the Prime Minister's answer there was his whenever he's faced one of these difficult questions, he issues that sort of blanket apology for upset caused, claims full responsibility without necessarily accepting their version of events or their diagnosis of the government's failings, and then deferring to the upcoming inquiry, which serves a very powerful political purpose.